Hey everyone, welcome back to Israel Matters. This is where we discuss the matters that matter most to Israel, especially these days in the wake of coronavirus, the pandemic that has had so much effect on the world. As always, we are here, that's Elliot, Chodoff, and myself discussing all these important matters. There are times where I'm interviewing Elliot, as I was last time, because it's a topic that he knows more about, so I'm the one asking questions. In future episodes, when we start discussing things that are more in my area of expertise, probably Elliot will be interviewing me. But I'm very grateful to be, partnering with Elliot in doing this. Elliot, you're just such a knowledgeable expert in so many things. So, thank you for doing this with me.
As are you.
Thank you. Last time we ended off, towards the end, we mentioned the verse in Psalms that the guardian of Israel does not slumber and does not sleep. And it got me thinking that the verse that follows that verse in Psalm 121 says, "The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade upon your right hand." And that's a very interesting phrase, that the Lord sort of looks over our right hand. Now, the expression "the right hand," which appears all over Scripture, especially in Psalms, as a metaphor for strength and as a metaphor for action, and quite often associated with even military action. So if we understand that that's what that phrase implies, I think this verse is actually saying something very interesting. It's not just saying that God watches over us and protects us and we're passive. What it means is that God watches over us as we use our right hand, as we take action. That God is there, he has our back. And I think that's a good segue back into our conversation, because while on the one hand we are people of faith and we know that God is watching over us and everything that we have is from God, and especially what God is doing in Israel over the last century and the modern state of Israel, that God is watching over us, but at the same time that's supposed to empower us to do what we need to do strategically and tactically and militarily in order to ensure our security. So let's pick up where we left off last time. We were talking about Hezbollah and the northern border and some of the sort of poking that Hezbollah has been doing, and trying to push the envelope and maybe move the lines on the chessboard, and how Israel should be responding or is responding to that. And as we said last time, you indicated that things are moving from the eastern side, meaning closer to Syria, towards the western.
Yes.
But we know that there's a lot going on in Syria also. I know that in the news there's been indications of airstrikes. You mentioned that there's some airstrikes that, of course, Israel doesn't talk about these things, but there's been some airstrikes where Israel has been hitting some enemy positions in Syria. And there was recently a news story about an Israeli drone that the Russians claim they shot down, and the Israelis, of course, say that didn't happen. And just in the bigger picture, you mentioned something interesting also last time. You said that people have this perception that because coronavirus is going on, that the issues of Israel's security are kind of on the back burner, but they're not. They're just not in the headlines, and the enemies of Israel and all the various operators, the nefarious operators here, are still very, very active. The same is true of the Syrian situation. Everyone knows that there's been this Syrian civil war and the collapse of the Syrian economy. But recently that's even gotten worse. So maybe let's shift our focus now a little bit to the east and talk about the impact of what's going on in Syria on Israel's security.
Okay, before I do that, I want to just roll back a bit to your quoting the verse of God being a shadow on our right hand. It's a long way back, but it's an important one because there's a practical aspect to it that I think is worth mentioning here, and maybe elaborating on some at another time. When you take the offensive, you are exposing yourself. In other words, people tend to think that, okay, so strike. But when you strike, those forces are actually more exposed, more vulnerable than they would be in defensive positions. So the idea that God protects your right hand has real practical implications, not just sort of a metaphorical, scriptural kind of an idea.
Oh, wow.
And
So,
I mention that because, but many people say, well, why doesn't Israel just do this? Why doesn't it just strike? Well, striking even in a victorious way carries possible disproportionate cost with it. That doesn't mean you don't do it, but you don't take it lightly. It's true. Anybody who knows martial arts knows that it's true. Whenever you extend, you're vulnerable. And so there are, not surprisingly, deep practical lessons in the scriptural verses.
wow.
Syria is, I would say, much more the battleground even than Lebanon. Lebanon is a kind of immediate, up close, in part because Hezbollah is sort of its own entity, and again, Hezbollah is a subject that we're going to have to deal with at some point or another in great depth. But Syria is a geographical as well as political battleground. As we know, it's not just the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, the Chinese, the Europeans, Americans are involved, terrorist organizations, ISIS in its day, but others. It's not a coincidence that Syria is such a magnet for trouble. Certainly part of it today has to do with the political situation in Syria, the regime that hasn't won but hasn't lost, because they're still there. In other words, here we have to make a very important distinction. Assad didn't fall, and you may remember back in the day when the uprisings began, everybody was eulogizing him, predicting his fall within a week, 10 days, he's gone. And here I have to say, and I'm on record from back then, I said he's not going. So I got that one right.
By the way, I remember hearing you say that.
Not losing is not.
Years ago.
Years ago, right? And everybody sort of raised their eyebrows. Where's he going with this?
Yeah.
And in fact, he hasn't gone, with a lot of help from his friends. But part of the reason they helped him is because they thought that it would work. Remember that one criterion in making decisions to go in, whether it's Iranian or Russian, is you're not going to back a loser if you know they're going to lose. So they backed him, they helped him, and that the help certainly worked. So he hasn't lost. But to say that he's won would be to overstate it. In other words, his country is still chaos. And for many of those who helped him, that suits them. In other words, the Syrian situation today suits the Russians, suits the Turks, suits the Iranians, suits the terrorist organizations, who can now use Syria basically as their playground without having to deal with a strong Syrian regime telling them what to do.
Well, Elliot,
so
let me just
for the people of Syria,
let me just understand what you're saying here. This is a very important point that just kind of paraphrase it back and understand that the chaos in Syria, the fact that everything's so unstable, actually is a very comfortable opportunity for all of these other operators, Russia, Iran, even Turkey, where they encroach, that allows them to operate. And just to share one statistic for our listeners, when this whole Syrian civil war first started, the Syrian pound was 47 Syrian pounds to the American dollar. And as of today, it's 3,000 Syrian pounds to the American dollar. So that economic collapse and the demonstrations in the streets, which again, they're not in the headlines anymore, but they're still going on today in Syria, demonstrations by the population in the streets.
Yes.
All of that instability and the weakness of the Assad regime really allows Iran and Russia to assert themselves more. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Got it.
I'm out clearly. I mean, think about, let's say, create an alternative situation. The Syrian regime becomes a fully stabilized regime that recontrols its territory. The first thing it does to its friends, quote unquote, is say, hey guys, thanks so much for your help. Go home.
Right. Asking them to leave.
Right. I mean, you want a naval base. Okay, we'll lease you something, but you don't get free run of the country anymore once the regime regains its power, rebuilds its military, stabilizes itself. It's no longer under threat. Keep in mind that every single one of those, here I'll generalize. Every time you have a foreign army on your territory, even by invitation, it's an erosion of your sovereignty. And I'll take that, to its most blatant historical extreme. When the U.S. military established itself in England in World War II, that harmed British sovereignty. Now, it was worth the price for Britain because they knew, first of all, they needed to defeat the Germans, and they also knew that when it was over, the Americans were going home. But while they were there, look, it's not a coincidence. The guy who commanded the whole operation was an American. The British military was essentially subordinated to the Americans. That hurts your sovereignty. Now, to do it for 4 years, 3 years, whatever, okay, and it's with a friend. The Syrians aren't in a position to turn to their friends and say, gee, guys, thank you very much, you got to go now. First of all, they don't have the strength to do it. And second of all, they don't have the stability to do it. And that suits all of those mischief makers, because let's not compare the Iranians and the Russians in Syria to the Americans in England in World War II. They're there to make mischief. And whether it's mischief against Syria in particular or against others via Syria is not good for Syria. So that instability suits them just fine. They're going to help Assad get past that sort of minimum barrier to stay in power, but they're not going to work very hard to stabilize him.
Wow.
Now, each of them have.
What does this mean for Israel, though? In other words,
okay.
I mean, I guess that's where you're headed with all this, but because
Yes.
Russia, Russia's not exactly an Israeli ally, but they're also not exactly an Israeli enemy, and they're there, and the Iranians are there. So, I guess we have to understand more about this. So, I'm
Okay.
sorry I interrupted you. Keep going.
No. Perfect question. First of all, let's understand that past that basic minimum of they're there to help the Syrians, they're all there for their own interests. And their interests don't necessarily coincide. Okay, so the Russians are there for purely Russian imperial interests. The Iranians are there for purely Persian Iranian imperial interests. The Turks for Turkish imperial, the Chinese for Chinese imperial, etc. The Western powers for their own economic and political reasons. I won't call it imperial because I think it's different, but and the United States as well. I refer to the U.S. as an imperial power, but not in the classic sense. But it's a global power, and the region is of importance to them. But none of those actors, and certainly not the terrorist organizations, none of them are there ultimately for the benefit of Syria, except insofar as what benefits Syria in the marginal sense suits their interests. Now, we start with the Russians because I think the Iranians, again, are going to be a whole sort of story, multi-talk issue in themselves. The Russians are there because they need ports on the Mediterranean. Imperial Russia, and I'm talking about pre-Soviet, Soviet, and post-Soviet Putin Russia, all Imperial Russia, have a problem, has had a problem historically, and that is that Russia's naval bases are north of the Arctic Circle. They get locked in by ice, and Russia needs what's known in the literature, and you may be familiar with the term, warm water ports. Warm water ports kind of sounds like a nice place to go swimming. What it really means is ports that don't freeze in the winter, because they need the ability to get their fleet in and out 12 months, 24/7, 12 months a year. Keeping in mind also, and this is an important aside, and as a ground forces officer, this pains me greatly to say, real imperial power is naval power. The ability to get around the world is naval power. The ability to fight on the ground, obviously, is ground power, but if you can't get there, it doesn't do you any good. So the Russians are acutely aware of it. By the way, note, Germany in 2 world wars was defeated in part because it didn't have sufficient naval power. It had incredible land power and insufficient naval power, just as an interesting aside. The Russians are in Syria because of that. I won't go into the whole long process of how it gets them there, but basically they have 2 naval bases on the Syrian coast, and their interest is to be able to get out of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. That's what they're doing there. That's a very, very long, involved strategy boiled down into 2 sentences. They're not here because of Israel. And this is a very, very big difference between the situation today and the Cold War, because Russia sees the United States as an adversary, not in the same way as the Soviets saw the Americans or the Warsaw Pact NATO conflict. First of all, that was ideological. Second, it was in a bipolar world. If you were on one side, you were the enemy of the other side. It was a very simple world, by the way, in those days. Today, Russia the world is much more in a classic situation, think 19th century, but you can go back as many centuries as you want, with multiple powers. There's one true superpower, the United States, but there are a lot of other powers out there, and they're jockeying against each other. So it's not just Russia versus the United States. It's Russia seeing the United States as an adversary, but so is China. Turkey and Russia have been in conflict for only about 400 or 500 years, which is why I was not in the least impressed when Putin and Erdogan signed a treaty. Let's not forget that Stalin and Hitler signed a treaty. These things don't really mean very much. Now, what that means for Israel is that unlike the Cold War, when the Soviets were in this region, Israel was seen as a natural enemy because it was allied with the United States. Today, because it's not a strict Russian-American conflict, but much more a sort of free-for-all, Putin's moves into the Middle East are much more strategically calculated. They have no ideology. One of the big differences between Putin and the Soviet leadership is, and this is true about him personally as well as intellectually, he's cold. There's no passion in what he's doing. And it's not that he's predictable, because a good strategist isn't predictable, but he's calculable in the sense that when he does something, you say, I understand why he's doing that. Because he's doing it by the book. The book doesn't dictate, the book gives you direction. Which is why we can have a negotiated position with him. Netanyahu and Putin get along very well, at least on the level of they can talk to each other. And Israel can do something in the situation that we're in today that it couldn't have done in the Cold War. And that is say to the Russians, look, you're not interested in us and we're not interested in you. We have a certain overlapping geographical interest in Syria. We have certain conflict interests because you're backing the Syrian regime and the Syrian regime is our enemy. But that doesn't mean that you and I have to fight. We need to just be aware of each other. Now, that doesn't make us friends. We're not friends.
Are you implying, doesn't this imply that the fact that Russia is not an ideological actor, and the fact that Russia does not see Israel as an adversary, but they're there for other reasons, doesn't that mean that from Israel's perspective, it could actually be a good thing to have Russia around, because there's someone in the arena who's not ideologically motivated against us, and who has the power to rein in some of the other more unstable actors. And maybe Israel would benefits from Russian power being part of the picture. That if they weren't there, it would only be the Iranians and the Turks, and everyone there would be ideologically enemies of Israel. Meaning what I'm asking is Russian presence there actually a positive thing for Israel's security?
I think positive is overstating it. But I would say that I can see, and I some of the things that you delineated are certainly true. There may be positive aspects to them being there. That's not the same thing as their being there is positive. Okay. Because of their pure interest in themselves, some of the things that they do will work positively for us, but it's incidental, it's not intentional. And that also means that if there's some sort of a ground shift, they'll just do the opposite, again, because they're not locked into ideology. So if, for example, a particular group, pick your group, it doesn't matter, unnamed, works to their advantage today, and they'll support them. If they don't work to their advantage tomorrow, they'll oppose them. If that group is good for Israel, when they're supporting them, it's good for us, and when they're opposing them, it's bad for us. But I don't think we're in any way a serious part of their calculation in terms of how they behave, unless it's affecting us directly. In other words, they're not going to use our airspace for their Air Force. So there they have to take us into account, and we try to be very careful not to get into conflict with them. We have good communications and that sort of thing. But needless to say, we're not friends, and therefore I'm not at all surprised that they claimed that they shot down an Israeli drone. I know nothing about it, but if I had to bet, I would bet yes. We're poking them, they're poking us, not for the purpose of irritating, but because when you have military force near your border that you have to be concerned with, you keep an eye on it. And keeping an eye on it sometimes means poking it. Not for the purpose of arousing it, but it's just the way it's done. And the fact that we would do it, if we're doing it, and again, I don't know for sure, but based on my experience and analysis, A, it wouldn't surprise me, and B, if we were going to do it, we would do it with a drone, not with manned aircraft.
Right.
You shoot down
Elliot,
a drone, it's deniable.
Yeah, we're gonna have to wrap up this episode because we're getting near the end of our time. Obviously,
Okay.
We can see that there's a lot of directions that we need to explore, and we have, there's plenty of material,
Yes.
for our subsequent conversations. What's in my mind as an Israeli citizen, and as for everyone who's watching, people who are concerned about Israel, what we talked about last time, where on the Lebanon border, it was like, oh my gosh, it could have escalated quickly into a real conflict. It sounds like the chaos in Syria, while there's a lot of volatility there, doesn't really pose an acute danger to Israel. Is that correct?
I would change the word acute to immediate. And I would say that's a subject, maybe that's what we need to deal with next week, and that's Iran and Syria, which is being permitted by the Russians, not opposed by the Russians. And the Iranian-Syrian aspect of this really is an acute threat to Israel. I would say it's the acute threat to Israel. But it's not immediate, in large part because of the actions that we're taking against Iran on a regular basis in Syria.
Wow. Okay. So I guess, we're not going to slumber and we're not going to sleep as long as we have, as long as we have a lot to deal with.
Because we can't. Yeah.
All right, Elliot. Thanks so much for doing this with me.
Thank you.
And we have to continue to pray for what's going on in America, and
Yes.
for healing in the in the population there, and let's remember that God watches over us, and thank God. All right, be well, everyone, and let's remember to care about what matters to Israel, what matters to us.